Now I've zipped forward to the 1930s. So during the 1930s to 1960s, we see something called marble cake federalism. I don't know if you've ever eaten a marble cake, but basically it's a sponge, and you see lots of different colours within it, so you can't really tell which bit is which. And that was what was happening during this time. So we didn't have the states going, we're doing this and federal government's going to do this, and we're completely separate. During this time we saw a sort of era of cooperation, and the reason for this was because America had seen its biggest depression, the Great Depression, and the big Wall Street crash. So the economy was just a mess, and unemployment was at an all-time high. 25% of Americans were unemployed. So during this time we saw federal government, Congress, taking the reins, and they created something called the New Deal, and they created they used the 16th Amendment to allow them to levy taxes, so income tax, so they could raise taxes and spend it and try to get the economy going. And I've put down here that they taxed individuals based on their earnings to improve infrastructure, and the money went to federal government. So it went back to federal government, and they tried to divvy out the money amongst all the states. And it was about getting the economy going. And this is, for those who do economics, this is Keynesianism. Now, we as politics students don't have to really talk about that in any great detail, but it's good to be aware of it. So Keynesianism is a sort of theory where we try to boost the economy by injecting money into it. So what they did was, during this time, federal government said, right, we're going to build hospitals, we're going to build schools. But to do that, they need people to work. So you need architects, you need builders, you need plumbers, you need cleaners, teachers, you need all of these people. Well, all those people get employed, they start spending money. So it's about boosting the economy that way. So the government intervenes, and this was federal government taking lots of control. And they were telling the states, we're going to do this, we're in control of this, you can't really handle this individually. This isn't for 50 different states to try to handle, we're going to take back control. And in this time as well, we saw an increase in block grants, where the government gave states just a chunk of money and said, spend it however you like, which is good for the states, so that's why I've drawn an arrow that way. But then we also saw categorical grants. And anytime you see categorical grants in any kind of literature, it means that the government has said to the states, you can have this money, you can have 2 million quid, but you've got to spend it on X, Y, and Z. And that effectively limits states' powers. So it was a sort of, it was mainly federal government taking lots of control and telling the states what to do. Sometimes they let the states decide on certain things. So if you turn over, we come on to something called coercive federalism. So if you coerce someone to do something, you're effectively making them do it. And here we see lots. This is an era where we see federal government gaining more and more power. So the first case I put down there is Brown versus Board of Education. And we've talked about this before, and again, those who do history might come across this. So they had said that they didn't want segregation to happen. So we had white children in one school, black children in another, white people using one set of buses, black people using another set of buses. And they said, no, this can't happen. But there were some states who were still carrying on with segregation. And in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court said it's not happening. Segregation violates the 14th Amendment. So this is federal government saying to the states, you can't do it. So again, it's federal government taking power and telling the states what to do. Now, then we come down to the states kind of trying to fight back. And we saw the states try to change their own constitutions to try to nullify all the laws that federal government was making. But in a case called Cooper versus Aaron, the Supreme Court reminded the states that the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, means that the Constitution is supreme to all of their laws. So these constitutions that the states were creating were pointless because ultimately the American Constitution is supreme. So there we see Supreme Court, federal government reminding states that they're not as powerful. And then we come on to something called the Great Society. So we're in the era of the 1960s, and this was an era where we saw lots and lots of rights being protected. The federal government expanded its role in terms of trying to tackle poverty, tackle racism, and there were two key acts that were created during this time. The first one was the Civil Rights Act, 1964, and the second one was the Voting Rights Act, 1965. So the Civil Rights Act 1964 said you cannot discriminate against people. It said on the basis of race, sex, etc. And the Voting Act one said you can't discriminate against people when they're trying to vote. So you can't have really difficult literacy tests that people can't pass, or you can't have rules about, you have to own this much property in order to be able to vote. Everybody should be able to vote. Now, before this, the states, so remember, they're still a little bit against having everyone as equal. They're still fighting federal government. They sometimes used to set these literacy tests, and a lot of the black community couldn't pass them because they'd come, a poorer. They were sort of, they didn't really have so much of a good sort of head start as the white community. They were coming from a poorer background. They might not have gone to school, or if they had, they might not have been in school for very long, and they couldn't pass these literacy tests, and it wasn't fair. So because they couldn't pass them, they couldn't vote. The idea here was that federal government was saying, no, we want everybody, all American citizens to be treated equally and to all have the franchise. Also, during this time, we saw something called Medicaid and Medicare being created and then expanded. So Medicare is where the American government or federal government will give money, well actually the states as well, will give money to people who don't have enough of their own money to pay for their own medical care. And their Medicaid is, we look after those who are older. Sorry, I've got those around the wrong way. Sorry, Medicare is where we care for the elderly. Medicare is where we give money for older people who need lots of medical care and they can't necessarily afford it. And Medicaid is for those who need aid. They've got a low income. They can't afford it. Remember, these are really, really important because in America they don't have an NHS system. You have to, if you want to go in for some medical treatment, you have to have medical health insurance. So Medicare and Medicaid are really, really important. So after this big great society where we see federal government expanding their involvement in tackling poverty, tackling racism, making sure that everyone's equal and telling the states what to do, we see an expansion of categorical grants. So we move away from President Johnson telling the states what to do, and we come into the era of Nixon and Reagan, who were both Republican presidents, and they return some of the power to states. So Republicans are not fans of big governments. So remember, they're more right-wing, they're more like the Conservatives. They don't want big government involvement. They think that really you should be left to your own devices, sort yourself out. And it's the same thing here. We saw Nixon and Reagan with new federalism saying, look, here's the money, states, here's some block grants, spend it however you like. And Ronald Reagan said federal government did not create the states created federal government. So there he is telling us that he has a massive respect for what the states do, and we have to leave the states to do what they think is best. It's not for federal government to become bigger.